And good morning to those that are joining us from the other side of the Atlantic. My name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I want to welcome everybody here today. Those who are joining in Ankara, those who are joining in Europe, Israel, and in the United States. On behalf of the German Marshall Fund, we want to thank you. This event today is being coordinated with our Washington office and our office in Ankara. So I want to thank our Ankara office for hosting this event. And I also really wanted just to join everybody in thanking our speakers. We have a great group of speakers today who are here to discuss Turkish-Israeli relations, whether or not there's a prospect of normalization of the relationship. Needless to say, as many of you know, Turkish-Israeli relations have been rocky for quite some time. I'm not going to go through the history of it, but over the last several years, we have seen previously what had been a years of what would some perceived as a golden year of relationship in the 1990s and early 2000s changed dramatically, starting in the mid-2000s to where we are today. Interestingly enough, of course, many of those that are joining us today have long been involved in analyzing this relationship or working from the government side, dealing with this relationship, know full well that Turkey and Israel are in essence critical, at one point were critical partners in the Eastern Mediterranean on significant issues impacting security, including that of Europe and the United States, and remain so today. So what we're going to do today is we're going to speak to what some perceived as a thaw. There's been a lot written lately about the normalization of relations, but also a thaw that occurred in the spring, and interestingly enough, related to COVID-19 and a very challenging situation facing Turkey, Israel, and the international community. Just some housekeeping for this event. We're going to the speakers that you see on the screen. They can't see you, so the speakers will be the only ones that you'll be able to see on screen. We're going to use a Q&A function that is located on your Zoom screen. I think everybody is quite familiar with the Zoom process, but feel free throughout the entire event to ask questions and to pose questions to our speakers. Let me do just a quick introduction. We have Roey Gilad, who's the Chargé d'Affaires Embassy of Israel, and he is a longtime diplomat, a senior diplomat for the Israeli government. Roey, thank you so much for being here and joining us. We have Şaban Kardaş, who's the Associate Professor of International Relations at TOBB Economics and Technology University. Şaban is also a frequent writer for GMF's On Turkey series, which is led out of our Ankara office. Şaban, it's great to see you again. And we're really pleased to have Gallia Lindenstrauss, who's a senior research fellow with the Institute for National Security Studies. Gallia is an expert on Turkey, Turkish-Israeli relations, Eastern Mediterranean issues, and both Şaban and Gallia are gonna, both of them have been writing extensively and looking into these issues over the last several years. So thank you so much for joining us today. And again, this is an on-the-record event, so we'll be able to share the video of this event after it takes place. But we want to thank everybody for joining, especially those who have just gotten up early in the morning in Washington to join. Thank you. First, I want to turn to Roey. You know, in looking at somebody who's sort of in the center of Israel's diplomatic efforts with respect to Turkey, we wanted to turn to you first to talk about the prospects of normalization, rapprochement, but also when looking at the Israeli government's priorities with respect to Turkey, there's obviously many. And of course, from the issues of Eastern Med energy supplies to challenges, security challenges from Syria to Libya, to the challenges including Hamas, internal challenges that face Israel, to economics and trade. And I don't think it's lost on anyone that despite the relationship being where it has been, the trade relationship between Turkey and Israel still remains vibrant. There was an exchange of support and engagement during the COVID-19 period in the spring that I think was welcomed by both sides. Yet there's not an ambassador, and you're doing an excellent job as the lead. But of course, one of the signs of a healthy relationship, diplomatic relationship, is ambassadors, an exchange of ambassadors. So on that, excuse me, on that note, I wanted to turn it over to you. You know, we can go through incidences from Marmara to some of the more recent challenges that we've seen. But I wanted to turn it over to you to talk about those priorities and to introduce this topic today. And then we're going to turn it over to Şaban and Gallia for their opening statements. Roey, over to you. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you very much, sir. I'd like also to thank the German Marshall Fund for hosting this important event. I'm looking forward to listen to what my two colleagues, Dr. Lindenstrauss from Israel and Dr. Kardaş from TOBB University, are about to say, and I'm sure I can learn a lot from them. However, let me just say a few words as somebody who represents Israeli interest in Turkey. Indeed, Jonathan, as you mentioned, we are now, I would say, 10 to 11 years in what I call the lost decade of the relationship between Israel and Turkey. We remember that the problem started during the famous Davos incident, 2009. 2010, we had the Marmara incident. Then there was a short time between December 16 and May 18, a year and a half, where we had an ambassador here. But overall, in the last 10, 11 years, I think the relationship suffered from many challenges. Now, indeed, first we need to ask ourselves, what is the meaning of normal relationship? You said, and I think you're correct, Jonathan, normal relationship basically means that both states have ambassadors on the other sides and consul generals either in Jerusalem or in Istanbul. This is not the situation currently. There is an Israeli Chargé d'affaires here, your humble servant. There is a Turkish Chargé d'affaires in Tel Aviv. Basically, I read in one of Gallia's articles that the strategic relationships that you also spoke about them, Jonathan, that we had in the 90s were an exception, actually, in relationship between two states, definitely states like Israel and Turkey. I don't think anybody is wishes currently, or wishes we can wish, but I don't think there is anybody that expects us to renew for Israel and Turkey those glory days of the relationship, what is known as the strategic relationship in the coming future. At the time we spoke about training of the two armies, of the two air forces, all kinds of plans in the field of energy that never came to exchanging intelligence, having a significant diplomatic dialogue. All those things, I think, currently are not relevant. But I think the problem goes beyond that, and this is even a normal relationship we do not have currently. So not only strategic relationship as in the 90s we don't have, but we even don't have normal relationship as we had until 2009 and 2010. What do we have? What we have now is basically maintenance of the relationship, maintaining some islands of cooperation, of partnership. I'm mainly talking about trade. Israel is still a significant trade partner of Turkey. In 2019, according to Turkish statistics, we had $6 billion of trade. According to Israeli statistics, by the way, we had $7 billion of trade. Most of it, I would say 2/3 is a Turkish export to Israel. Only 1/3 is Israeli export to Turkey. We still have, at least pre-COVID-19, significant tourism. According to Turkish numbers, 500,000 Israelis spent some vacations in Turkey in 2019. Many other Israelis use Istanbul airport as a hub. You know, Israelis are obsessed with the Far East, and they like to go to look for cheap deals to go to the Far East. And cheap deals you can find either through Aeroflot from Moscow or from Turkish Airlines from Istanbul. Many Israelis took the option or choose the option of Istanbul, and the airport, the new airport in Istanbul was full with Israelis just before COVID-19. Most of the trade between Turkey and Jordan will go through Israel nowadays, since the trucks cannot cross anymore Syria. So those are few, I would say, islands of normality, but those islands are within an ocean of abnormality. I think currently the two governments are facing some serious bilateral challenges. You mentioned, Jonathan, the issue of the Hamas. The Israeli government is very unhappy with some activity of Hamas in Istanbul. I'm talking about terror-related activity. We brought it to the attention of the Turkish government. Unfortunately, nothing was done. I understand that Turkey has a problem with the Israeli attitude vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Our counter-argument is that, fine, we can deal with every criticism, but I think the way it is being done between Israel and other countries, mainly Egypt, Jordan, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, shows that you can achieve much more influence on the Israeli agenda by conducting a diplomatic dialogue, not by using a megaphone dialogue. And I think the attitude of Turkey to megaphone diplomacy caused, I would say, a damage to the bilateral relationship, and doesn't make Turkey more relevant to the Palestinian issue. I think it keeps Turkey quite far from the Palestinian issue, and if indeed Turkey would like to be more relevant to the Palestinian issue, just like Jordan, just like Egypt, just like UAE, I think a more, I would say, diplomatic dialogue should be dealt with, and not so much megaphone and public one. Unfortunately, this is the current picture. I don't want to depict too rosy picture. Relationship decent, but there is much more to look for. Even those islands I mentioned, trade, I think we can reach from the 6-7 billion now, we can reach 10 billion if relationship would have been better. Tourism, we could have reached much bigger numbers if relationship would be better. Definitely on energy, I'm sure it's going to come up later on. Currently, we don't have anything. We have only conflicts with Turkey on this issue. We could have achieved much more had the relationship been better. On Syria, another issue you mentioned, Jonathan, I think both states, Israel and Turkey, are facing very, very similar challenges, and we could have achieved much more to address those challenges successfully if there were to be a dialogue between two states. We have to be realistic. Since I know you're going anyway to ask me later on, let me just say, Jonathan, that I do not expect any significant breakthrough in the future to come. I believe, again, as I wrote and said several times, the ball is on the Turkish side. Turkey knows what needs to be done in order to normalize the relationship. Currently, we don't have any signs that the Turkish side is indeed going to pick up this issue and try to normalize the relationship. I say the ball is on the Turkish side because basically it was Turkey that asked our former ambassador to leave in May 2018, that is to say 2 years ago. So obviously that puts the ball on the Turkish side. I thank you very much.
Thank you. And I want to just, one of the things that's quite striking is that you started off saying this was a lost decade of relations. And certainly by all measures, except for when you take the trade component out of it, the economic component, certainly that was the case. But there's always the perspective from Ankara is different in terms of both its priorities, priorities of Mr. Erdogan and his government. And when I look both at Israel and I look at Turkey, they have two long-standing leaders, both Mr. Netanyahu, Mr. Erdogan, that have sort of dominated both the political but the security scene, that have played a role. But I wanted to turn to Şaban too, just to bring him in to talk about how Ankara views this relationship. You heard from Roey that the ball is in the court of Ankara and the Turkish government. And what was mentioned, when I talked earlier about this, I said it was a bit of a spring thaw in the relationship, with some hope, very positive articles being written. You had El Al flight going to Turkey for the first time in quite some time. Humanitarian assistance, even if it was being purchased, was coming from Turkey. We've seen this go up and down before, but Turkey faces some very serious and challenging security issues. It's got massive challenges with refugees at home. Also, a very significant economic downturn in Turkey that's been taking place for the last couple of years. Can we expect, or might we see some changes coming from Ankara that might alter the relationship? I think obviously anytime you can sort of increase trade, that's great. But these other outstanding issues, and we didn't really delve into Libya, but can maybe speak to some of the viewpoints from Ankara, just as a counterpoint to, or not a counterpoint, but the perspective that you would expect a Turkish official speaking about these issues to talk about. So Şaban, you're not an official of the government, and I also just want to point out, just for TOBB has long played a role too in support of Israeli-Palestinian peace. And Şaban, you may not know that from back in the 2000s, but that was a role they played. Şaban, can I send it over to you now? Thank you.
Definitely, thank you. Actually, TOBB and the think tank affiliated with TOBB, also our university, TOBB, they are running a project in the industrial zone. As you mentioned, they have been trying to play their positive role in the process, but because of the broader political diplomatic disputes, such efforts were also limited in terms of their scope and potential impact. Of course, I will speak from an academic and analytical point of view. Right now, I am in the office at the university. The presidential palace is just next to me. If I were to remove the curtain, you would have a view, but then the sunlight will change the view. That's why it is closed. No, from an academic point of view, if I were to look back at this past decade briefly first, and then respond to your questions regarding where we stand, I would also, to some extent, second Roey, in the sense that there might be some islands of cooperation and normality, but despite that, in the broader picture, the factors that speak against enhanced relations, they are stronger at this point as well. So briefly, this analogy of the ball is anybody's court, in the Turkish court. I would start from that expression to get into the mindset of the Turkish decision makers regarding the relations with Israel. I think from a Turkish point of view, the ball would be in the Israeli court, in the sense that when we look at how we got here, what were the main issues, what were the factors behind the failure of many attempts at normalization, it was the Israeli misdoings from a Turkish point of view. In the initial phase, when we look at 10 years ago, when this entire episode started, when we leave aside many differences, at the end of the day, when we look at Turkey-Israeli relationship, there is no natural enmity. I mean, you cannot identify any issue that would put Turkey and Israel on opposite sides from a geopolitical point of view, structurally. But only the Palestinian issue, the Israel's treatment of Palestinians from the perspective of Turkish leadership, this is the main dividing line. And I think this is where we have seen in the last decade, many times the strategic realities and identity politics come into conflict with each other. Each time the identity politics prevailed on the Turkish side, ideational factors prevailed. And that's why I think, in response to your question, if a Turkish decision were to respond to Roey's observation that the ball is on the Turkish side, they will say, no, the ball is on the Israeli side. They have to change their attitude. They have to change the way they behave. So this is where I think still at this point in time, the expectation from a Turkish point of view will be to see some change on the Israeli side before a meaningful normalization, especially finding a just, equitable and sustainable solution to the Palestinian issue. That still remains a precondition from a Turkish point of view. But very briefly, I think why we had this very troubled decade, both domestically in terms of leadership level, in terms of regional level, the stars did not align. The stars fed rather negative dynamics in the bilateral relationship. We already referred to strong leaders with fixed opinions on certain issues on both sides, as you referred to. But other than that, the domestic context in both sides, they did not support a conducive normalization, in the sense that there was a kind of indifference, at least in the Turkish case, vis-a-vis the issue of Israel. So here the question we should ask, what is the cost of non-normalization? What is the cost of that troubled decade for the overall strategic stand of each country? From a Turkish domestic point of view, the past decade of relationship did not come with a big cost. You refer to the trade relationship, economic potential. One might also make the argument that perhaps there was underperformance. Maybe the 5-6 billion trade might have reached to 10 billion if there were some better relationship. Despite these lost opportunities, one cannot make a convincing argument to Turkish domestic public that by not normalizing, by not improving relations with Israel, Turkey lost a lot. So that's why I think in terms of the domestic context, there was a kind of indifference to this normalization agenda, normalization program. But at the same time, the regional environment is very important. That decade, which Roey referred to as a very troubled, bumpy decade, came at a time the region was going through an enormous, extraordinary period in the modern history. The Arab uprisings, the regional turmoil, especially what we experienced in Syria, Iraq, radicalization, movement of refugees, movement of foreign terrorist fighters, the state collapse or fragmentation, so on and so forth. So the troubled relationship took place against a very troubled Middle Eastern regional security environment. So in that respect, when we weigh the poor performance, we should also take into account this regional environment. And I think a major reason why we had such a troubled relationship was different readings on both sides. So the Turkish reading of regional environment, without going into detail, was of course more pro-change versus Israel, which decided to support the status quo forces in the regional transformation, Gulf monarchies, and decided to address its own security challenges by redesigning its alliances. All these transformations in Israel's relationship with the Gulf states, I think eventually these different readings of the regional environment resulted in also worsening and weakening of the Turkey-Israeli relationship. So in that sense, regional environment made a negative feedback to the bilateral relationship, which we cannot exclude. But here, of course, the broader transformation in the Turkish foreign policy thinking, both in terms of strategic priorities, but also style, which is also important to understand the manner in which Turkey was reacting to certain of Israel's policies. For instance, what Roey referred to, a an alternative Turkish approach to Palestinian issue by getting closer to Israel. Many people do argue that Turkey can, in fact, gain a different leverage over Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinian rights, but instead of that, Turkey chose a rather assertive, confrontational line. I think this is also very much related to the style of the new Turkish foreign policy, which was fostered under Akbar in many decades. So coming to today, where do we stand and where we can go very briefly by keeping in mind the time considerations. I would say that compared to 3 to 5 years ago, we are in a better shape in terms of the islands of cooperation, again using the same phrase. Convergence is increasing, as was also mentioned by you and Roey, in the sense that in Syria, overlapping considerations regarding the activities of Iran in the broader Middle East, so on and so forth. The islands of converging, it is increasing, but despite it, I think we are still far from true normalization. The best the parties can achieve is, from a Turkish point of view, some sort of compartmentalization. This concept we use a lot in the context of Turkish foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Iran. I think at this stage, the best we can aim at, the best we can hypothesize is some sort of compartmentalization between Turkey and Israel, to what extent it is possible. Personally, if you were to ask my opinion, it may happen, but even if it does, it won't be declared publicly. It won't be kind of implicit de facto policy. But even there, on certain files, especially energy was mentioned, maybe we can expand on it during the Q&A. The prospects might also be limited given the very nature of the energy environment, energy business. So here at this stage, speaking of the future, I can list a few positive factors that does support sort of an enhanced relationship versus some negative factors. On the positive side, I would say the impact of the regional environment is in a better shape compared to 5 years ago. The regional insecurity, the cycle of insecurity in the Middle East, I would say has lessened to some extent. The security pressures on the regional countries, including Turkey and Israel, are lessened, which may potentially create some more conducive environment. So we are not at the heat of ISIS and state fragmentation in Iraq and Syria. So today things seem a bit calmer. So in that respect, I think there might be better opportunities. But at the same time, I would also say that Turkey might be seen by Israel in a different light than it used to 3 or 5 years ago, in the sense that Israel has also reached the limits of its new regional alignments with the Gulf countries. So it has realized to what extent it can accomplish certain things, to what extent it cannot. The limits to the new alignments of Israel in the Middle East, they are also obvious. And we also know that new Turkish foreign policy, parameters of the new Turkish foreign policy. So in that respect, I think there is some chance for rethinking of Turkey-Israel relationship on the basis of the new realities. It doesn't need to be full normalization, but some sort of compartmentalized relationship based on the existing regional realities. As I mentioned, the shared concerns about especially Iran's activities, stability of Iraq, so on and so forth, these are obvious, they are there. Israel can make its own reading of the new Turkey, and Turkey can make its own reading of new Israel and move from there. But despite that positive factor, there are also still negative factors, which I will very briefly list here. In terms of the domestic level, I would say that unfortunately the domestic factors still do not speak strongly in favor of full normalization. The relative indifference on both sides continues, and especially here we should refer to the weakening of the power of the constituencies on both sides. Constituencies of Turkey-Israel normalization, they are weakening, they are marginalized to some extent in other places. But here also in terms of, for instance, economy, we should refer to the impact of COVID-19, how it is dealing a blow to domestic economy, to what extent it will lead to some sort of negative repercussions. So in addition to the indifference, the domestic trends on both sides, Turkey is going through, of course, very serious transformation since the transition to the presidential system, the upcoming presidential elections, whether in time or early. So these are all creating very troubled relationships. So same for Israel. And then the second factor that makes me kind of skeptical about fuller normalization is this notion, this linkage between economic opportunities and diplomatic normalization. In a recently launched Turkish magazine, Roey was making an argument for better relations. He was saying that normally economic opportunities should create better diplomatic normalization. Yes, that's a very good hypothesis that comes from liberal international relations theory as well, but Turkish-Israeli relationship so far has proved otherwise. And I think it does, it can still continue to prove otherwise. The economic rationality doesn't always lead to political normalization. So the factors are still there. So here, very briefly, just my argument about the energy issues. Energy may bring countries together, but it can also divide. So it is still at this phase, I would say. And regarding the EastMed pipeline and the broader East Mediterranean energy resources, the prospects for normalization based on the energy partnership, this argument was on the table in the last 10 years, but it hasn't proved to be true in the sense of leading normalization. At this stage, there is no new indicator that it should be the otherwise. And lastly, I should refer to this tension between identity and interest in the making of Turkish foreign policy. Sometimes this issue also overlaps with this discussion. To what extent AK Party foreign policy means Turkey's national foreign policy? Some of the outside observers, especially Israeli analysts, sometimes bet their hopes on the assumption that AK Party does not represent entire Turkey. There is a bigger Turkey than what AK Party's foreign policy priorities do suggest. But despite that, we cannot differentiate the two. Definitely, there is an AK Party foreign policy, but it does also overlap with the strategic national interests of Turkey. So at this juncture, especially when we look at the East Mediterranean discussions, there is a bigger coalition than AK Party's core strategic identity, especially nationalist, ultra-nationalist groups are also aligned behind the current policy. Here is the challenge. To what extent these policies are sustainable? Yes, definitely when it comes to the relationship with Israel and Egypt, for that matter, many of the allies of AK Party would suggest full normalization with Israel and Egypt. They would criticize the government for not normalizing with Israel. But despite that, I would say that here, a note to our Israeli friends, colleagues, there is this risk of pet dependence. To the extent that the current Israeli path toward entering into anti-Turkey alliances deepens, it takes its own life course, it creates its own dynamics in the sense that not only the AK Party's core constituency, but also the secular nationalist forces, they also over time will come to see Israel's policies as non-aligned or against Turkey's national interests. I think there is this pattern which is deepening and growing, and the new entanglements in the EastMed alliances Israel has been establishing with Greece, Greek Cyprus, and other countries may also undermine potential compartmentalized relationship between Turkey and Israel. I should add this note and end it here.
Şaban, thank you for that wonderful breakdown of from the perspective of Ankara. And I'm going to turn to Gallia next, but I was fascinated about your, we started off talking about a lost decade, and I agree that Roey started off with that. And I'm going to ask, we're in a new decade now. So what are the prospects for that new decade? And the issue of convergence and divergence is really important. And it strikes me, I go back to this, whether or not there's flexibility within the leadership of both countries to even make these changes. They're so ingrained just in terms of the cult of personality of the leadership, of whether Erdogan or Netanyahu has the capability or want to change this relationship in a meaningful way, not even taking into account all the issues that are at play. But I think it was really important to get that perspective. Gallia, can I bring you into you've been listening. I think, usually people are half glass half full when it comes to relationships. It's really hard to be that way when it comes to Turkish-Israeli relations. And the trends that Şaban is talking about internally are ones that I think people should take quite seriously, but also, in Israel as well, and how Israelis view Turkey, the Turkish-Israeli relationship, based on what's taken place over the last decade has certainly altered perhaps the perception of Turkey, but yet Israelis still flock to Turkey for vacations, for trade. And I don't want to, Şaban, I think it's so important, I think, just in terms of the relationship, the economic part of it still remains so important, even if it remains the one bright shining star of the relationship, that at some point in time, the relationship, Turkey and Israel will likely have new leaders. I don't know when that will take place. You mentioned the presidential election. If you look at Turkey's domestic political scene, it's dramatically changed even in the last 3 years after local elections took place. New mayors. That doesn't necessarily change the foreign policy direction at this point, but there's certainly significant changes. So Gallia, you're an observer. You've been writing. Do you share Şaban's point of view regarding the convergence, these issues where there's opportunities that perhaps the scene in terms of security, you mentioned Şaban, Iraq, Syria, a number of other issues, but then you also highlighted, these new relationships that have formed over the last several years. I think of Cyprus, Greece, Israel on Eastern Med issues. And I also think a lot about, we're talking about this too, about the United States in some respects withdrawing in certain aspects of engagement in this region, and particularly challenging relationships, particularly with Turkey, U.S.-Turkish relations, European-Turkish relations, that anchor for Ankara is less than what it used to be. So Gallia, can I turn to you next to respond to both Roey and then also to Şaban? Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to talk today, both for the German Marshall Fund office in Ankara and in Washington. And I think the reasons for the fallout between Israel and Turkey in the past decade have already been quite well analyzed. So I would like to focus on why the Normalization Agreement of June 2016, that was designed to settle the issue of the flotilla crisis, did not hold for more than 2 years. And in my talk, you'll see that I will echo many of the things that Şaban said, but in a slightly different angle. So first, I would like to point out that 2.5 weeks after the Normalization Agreement was signed, the 2016 failed coup attempt in Turkey took place. And this, of course, had major domestic repercussions, but it also resulted in a much more assertive Turkish foreign policy. Now, this much more assertive foreign policy has put Ankara in direct confrontation with some of the countries Israel is closely collaborating with. And Şaban mentioned these countries that can be Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Greece, and Cyprus. This brings me to a second point, that the reactions of Cyprus and Greece to the 2016 normalization agreement between Turkey and Israel was to deepen their cooperation with Israel. And they began to conduct several trilateral meetings at the highest level, which caused concern in Ankara. Thirdly, a significant push for Ankara and Jerusalem to reach the normalization agreement of 2016 was the prospects of the export of natural gas resources off Israel's shores to Turkey. This agenda has not moved forward at all since the normalization agreement was signed, because such a pipeline would have to be built in the Republic of Cyprus economic waters. And the failure of the Crans-Montana talks to unify the island in 2017 made this option complicated. Also, we should say that the price of Israel's natural gas was too high for Turkey. Moreover, Israel moved with Cyprus and Greece, as mentioned, to promote the idea of the East Med pipeline. And also Israel advanced in the talks with Egypt to use its LNG liquefying facilities for the export of Israeli gas. Since the coronavirus outbreak and the decline in energy prices, the prospect for the export of natural gas resources from the area have significantly decreased. So I would agree with Şaban that it is not likely that the energy agenda will push Turkish-Israeli relations forward. Another issue has been the change in the focus of Turkish criticism of Israel from the issue of Gaza to a greater emphasis on Jerusalem. So if you remember, in December 2017, President Erdogan threatened to cut relations entirely with Israel over the issue of the US embassy move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And in May 2018, when the embassy was moved, he partially materialized this threat. And not only did the Ankara withdraw its ambassador, but also told the Israeli ambassador to go home for consultation. Lastly, it seems that the level of mistrust between the countries, and more specifically between Netanyahu and Erdogan, which is mentioned, has been in reign for a long time, remains high. And there is little appetite in both countries to improve relations. Also, while in the early years of the crisis between Israel and Turkey, Israel adopted mainly a containment approach. After the signing of the normalization agreement, the attitude became a tit-for-tat approach, meaning that harsh Turkish rhetoric does not go unanswered, and Israel usually responds with criticism on Turkey on its handling of Cyprus and the Kurdish issue, which of course, these tit-for-tat rhetorical battles only cause the tensions to rise between the countries and the mistrust between the leaders also to grow. With regard to the cost of the current state of relations for both countries, I would agree with Şaban that while far from ideal, it is also not too difficult for the states to absorb. However, if the countries move from the status of just rivalry to the status of outright hostility, here the cost will be much graver. Both countries have other conflicts that require much attention and resources, and they clearly do not need new quarrels with another regional powers. With regards to the odd of rapprochement, I agree with the Chargé d'Affaires that we should have a narrow aim, and that should be bringing back the ambassadors. Obviously, there were problems of political instability in Israel, and the annexation plans of Netanyahu made the prospects of bringing back the ambassadors more difficult. But the hardship in the handling of the coronavirus, both in Israel and in the West Bank, have made Netanyahu's annexation plans much more difficult to implement in the short run. And the likely change, according to recent polls in the US administration in November, will also make it harder to push the annexation agenda later on. This does create space for the return of ambassadors to Ankara and Tel Aviv. As relations between the states have not been formally downgraded in May 2018, such a move can be done from today to tomorrow. The return of ambassadors, however, will not solve the underlying problems and tensions in relations, which both Şaban and I have outlined. So while such a move will be a positive one, one should not overstate its meaning. Now, what factors can improve the chances for rapprochement in the future? So if you would put the Israeli and Turkish representative in one room, clearly much can be discussed, be it Syria's future, Iran's nuclear plan, Eastern Mediterranean tension, and also the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians if there will be a resumption of talks. The problem is not lack of joint concerns, but rather when you break these issues down, the different priority each country gives to each component. For example, with regard to Syria, Turkey sees the main threat coming from the Kurdish elements, and Israel is more concerned with Iranian and Hezbollah involvement. There are also differences in what the actors perceive is the right solution for this major problem. For example, while Turkey advocates negotiations with regard to the Iranian nuclear program, Israel advocates a much tougher stance. The light in the tunnel in Turkish-Israeli relations in the past decade has been, as mentioned already, the economic relations. We had the record high trade relations in 2019, which was already mentioned. And also the tourist levels, the number has been mentioned, more than 500,000 Israelis, but it should be mentioned that this means that the tourism level has bounced back to the pre-flotilla numbers. Unfortunately, the coronavirus makes the resumption of tourism less likely. But with regard to trade, I think optimism is still due, since the push towards geographical closer supply chains make Israel and Turkey ideal economic partners. And I will stop here, but I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you. And thank you for walking us through all this. And I think a good counterpoint to Şaban and to Roey. But I wanted to just, if I can, ask the question about annexation. And I don't disagree with you, Gallia, on the sort of timing. And I think the U.S. election could have an impact on sort of how the U.S. approaches this, although I'm not quite sure what that will exactly be. And we still have 4 months to go until that time. But maybe to also bring in Şaban, because I want to get a sense from you what he thinks the response of the Turkish government would be to partial annexation. What do you think would be the steps taken by the government? Some people see, Ankara and Ankara's interest and Erdogan's interest that he might feel the need to respond in a very harsh way to this. And clearly, if the response to the moving of the U.S. embassy, to Jerusalem, and which for many people that's important, for others it may be not as significant as something such as annexation of parts of the West Bank, one would expect it to be a pretty significant reaction from Erdogan to this. And also, it's quite clear that he has always, in the last decade, has tried to play this role of being more, in a sense, more kosher on Palestinian issues than others, and that's been part of his engagement, and particularly in the Arab world. And so I'm just wondering what we would expect, and Gallia, maybe too, just your thinking as well on what would be the reaction, or even a counter reaction. So Şaban, over to you, just for an initial question.
Well, at this stage, we don't really know what it will take, what will be its form, content, the annexation, whether it will be a symbolic move, physical territorial annexation, how much of land, we don't know. Probably over time we will see. It may not happen at all, depending on the evolution of events. Probably we will see also the result of the US presidential elections, what kind of a US administration there will to react. So there are big unknowns, but in any case, even in terms of a very symbolic declaration of annexation, Turkish reaction will be strong. In terms of regular diplomatic protests, whatever could be done have been done already, so there may not be much in terms of lowering diplomatic relations, so on and so forth. But I think at this point it will be more in the form of rhetorical mobilization, domestic audiences, regional audiences, international wise. Probably this move will not be welcomed by other members of the international community anyway, so probably Turkey will also try to make a big effort in that respect. So here let's note that a Turkish person has been chosen to chair the UN General Assembly. Probably we will try to create more international reaction to this using such outlets, OIC as well. So here I think it will be used for mostly international diplomatic initiatives by the Turkish leadership, which will also flow well with the domestic mobilization purposes.
Gallia, can you jump in as well too? I mean, there's a lot of unknowns about this, and obviously Şaban is speculating. It's hard to do when you don't know exactly what this is going to look like, and you don't, not in the government, but certainly just based on previous history of responses, one would expect the Turkish government to respond. But not only the Turkish government, but others. Şaban mentioned the relationship of Israel and partners in Gulf, Egypt, and others obviously would have to react as well. But maybe just your thinking as you're looking at this too, based on your experience as to what you think the response might be. And of course, there will also be an internal response, both in Israel, but also among the Palestinians as well. And so that could also factor into a response.
So I agree completely with Şaban that there will be a lot of rhetorical criticism, and we already heard major Turkish figures criticize Israel on even its plans for annexation. I agree that since the ambassador was already withdrawn, you cannot do the simple diplomatic move of withdrawing the ambassador. You have to think more creatively, and I agree with Şaban, it will be in international forums. Both, he mentioned the UN General Assembly and the OIC, and in general, I think Turkey will try to broaden the discussion to the broader Muslim world. This has a problem with the others, what you would call the pragmatic Sunni powers. They have their own issues with Turkey, so it will have, and Turkey criticized them about not being tough enough with Israel on the issues concerning the Palestinians. So it can't really go to the more inner circle. It has to broaden to the other Muslim powers. I would think of Pakistan, for example, as something, as an actor that Turkey would like to cooperate on these issues. But again, from Israel now, we in Tel Aviv today, we're very much focused on the coronavirus, and more importantly, also the West Bank. The coronavirus seems to be out of control. So it would be very hard today to promote such a move of annexation, which you think would cause violence. And in the context of the coronavirus, I think plans have been postponed. I'm not in the government, I don't know, but my feeling is that the coronavirus has made the annexation plans much more difficult to implement.
Jonathan, can I jump in for a second?
Yes, absolutely.
So a few weeks ago, the UAE ambassador in where you are, Washington, Yusuf al-Taiba, gentleman that I assume you know, published an article that was published in the Israeli most popular newspaper, Yediot Ahronot, Ynet, that really became an issue in Israel. And, you know, I think part of the reason that the implementing of what you call it the annexation plan, we call it implementing the American peace plan, was postponed for the time being, is criticism that we got from some friends in the Arab world. I'm talking about Egypt, I'm talking about Jordan, I'm talking about UAE, I'm talking about Saudi Arabia. I asked myself if the Turkish ambassador in Washington would have published such an article in the Israeli media criticizing the implementing of the annexation plan, if you wish, would it get such an attention as the article that was published by the UAE ambassador in Washington? The answer is no. And that's my point. And basically, also our friends within the Arab world, the four friends that I mentioned, maybe some others that should not be mentioned here, they do not welcome the Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And that's something that can and should be debated. Nevertheless, the constructive, open diplomatic dialogue they have with Israel makes them much more relevant to the Palestinian issue. And if indeed Turkey would like to become relevant to this big question, to this big conflict, then I believe such a dialogue should be conducted between Ankara and Jerusalem, not a public one, not throwing stones day in and day out. And again, I think if Turkey would like to be relevant to Gaza, if Turkey would like to be relevant to the West Bank, a much different agenda should be conducted in Ankara vis-a-vis Jerusalem and vis-a-vis this question.
Does anybody want to respond to that, Gallia, Şaban? I mean, I think it's I would say Turkish ambassador making statements on this topic in Washington, correct, would probably not get the same attention. But also the idea and concept of Turkey altering its policy, you know, at sort of really at the top to reposition itself with really sort of a different set of positions, because now obviously there has been a relationship with Hamas, and that was a driver back even when I was in Congress working on these issues back in the late 2000s. But Şaban, maybe just some thoughts in response to the Chargé.
Yeah, I mean, as I also partly reflected on during my own intervention, I mean, this argument which was put forward by Roey and many others as a justification of better relations with Israel. So many senior commentators in Turkey, especially in close relationship with Republican People's Party, some retired diplomats do make the same argument. In our Palestine policy in the last decade or so, especially since 2008, instead of serving the Palestinian cause, we in fact undermined the Palestinian cause because we destroyed the bridges to Israel. That kind of argument is there. I see the argument, definitely this is being made, but the new foreign policy thinking posture is not buying into this argument. So the argument here is Turkey putting its own priorities where it sees quote unquote injustice, it makes its own argument, it does criticize, it does stand. So this is the new posture, also the image of President Erdogan, a leader that can stand against injustice. So that's why I wouldn't expect to see such an op-ed, and probably from a Turkish point of view, the UAE ambassador's op-ed in an Israeli outlet may not reach the same impact, may not have the final impact compared to the Turkish assertive posture in international diplomatic fora. So such kind of forging closer relationship with Israel to achieve something positive vis-a-vis Palestinian rights is seen as a kind of expression of a docile foreign policy posture. So I wouldn't expect something like that. This is what I can say at this point.
Gallia, do you want to jump in on this, or we can start with, we can go to questions? And please, for everybody who's watching, please pose your questions now.
I would just agree that the more cooperative approach to Israel, I think, is more conductive for the Palestinian cause. And I think we tend to talk about the 1990s as the height of Turkish-Israeli relations, but there are others who argue that just before the flotilla, the involvement of Turkey in the mediation between Israel and Syria, and the fact that in the Turkish parliament, both the Israeli president and the Palestinian president spoke at the same time, that was really the height of the achievement of Turkey in its policy vis-a-vis Israel. So I think, yes, we should aim to go back to the days where Turkey is usefulness is that it talks to both sides and it can help in bridging the differences between them.
Great, thank you. Gilad, why don't we, I know there's been a couple of questions posed. Maybe we'll start with those questions, at least one of the questions, and then we'll take some more. So over to you, Gilad.
Thank you, Jonathan. Happy to join you to read the questions. And the first two are from Dr. Alexander Lengro. And the first one is about the Palestinian aspirations. And for maybe future reference, if you are submitting question, maybe you might want to mention to whom the question is addressed to. But for this one, it looks like Şaban Bey can pick this. To which extent has Turkey acted as an advocate of Palestinian aspirations? Has it felt a need to step in for other Islamic in parentheses, mostly Arab countries? And what has Recep Tayyip Erdogan's position been in this?
Yeah, the Turkish concern about the rights of Palestinians is not a singular event. It is part of a broader pattern in Turkish foreign policy party. It is part of course, the way the President Erdogan is also portrayed in terms of domestic and international posturing, defender of the oppressed, especially the Muslims. So we have seen it expressed the same policy, the same consideration in other areas, especially if we recall, for instance, the Rohingya Muslims, but also in the Middle Eastern context during the Arab uprisings, we have seen the same vis-a-vis the Egyptian demonstrations, Tunisian demonstrations, but also in terms of the protection of the Syrian refugees, both in Turkey, but also overall Turkish policy vis-a-vis Syria are justified from a similar conceptual framework, defending the rights of the oppressed, especially the Muslims. So you can give quite many examples. For instance, if you look at Istanbul recently, many of the opposition figures from Arab countries that are facing persecution in their home countries, they are also given shelter in Turkey. So these are all different manifestations of the same policy.
Thank you, Şaban Bey. And the next one is again from Dr. Alexander Lengrov. And you had already, all of our speakers had mentioned in their remarks that the regional security environment, energy, US involvement had an impact on the relations. But this one is also asking about the relations and Palestinians. If progress is achieved in the Turkish-Israeli discussion of issues related to the Palestinians, would you expect the relationship to considerably improve, or are the other issues serious enough to prevent this? Would you like to add something, or is this already covered? Şaban Bey?
Very briefly, I mean to reiterate what we already said. My understanding is the Palestinian issue is very substantive. If that reaches a settlement of sorts from a Turkish point of view, that will be just, equitable, and sustainable for the Palestinian rights. I think it will remove the big stomach block before full normalization. That's big. So Gallia referred to Iran, Iraq, other issues is Mediterranean. There are differences between Turkey and Israel, for instance, about how to deal with Iran. These are, in my understanding, important. They are going to remain there, but these are secondary. They are not substantive differences. So on the big picture regarding the Iranian nuclear program, Iran's regional policies, the two countries do overlap. Vis-a-vis Syria as well, about the end game, their perspectives overlap. The specifics, more tactical level differences will remain, but on many of the regional hotspots, I think the differences are secondary. There are not substantive, natural, structural differences on any given strategic issue. They can be easily overcome. They can be relegated to technical level. If from a Turkish point of view, I think the president feels that the Palestinian issues addressed in a way that would satisfy his broader strategic mindset.
Thank you, Şaban. Gallia, would you like to add? Oh, sorry, Mr. Gilad, please go ahead.
I will say it in a diplomatic way. It's very easy to speak about finding a solution to the Palestinian conflict. Let me remind you that this conflict in 2020 is, quote unquote, celebrating 100 years of since its birth. If you wish, we consider 1920 to be maybe the year where we witnessed the first national clash between Jews and Arabs in Israel/Palestine. Nevertheless, so that's a very, I would say, deep and significant conflict that we have there. Nevertheless, we are facing basically two Palestinian coalitions, one in Ramallah and one in Gaza. One is led by the Palestinian Authority, which basically would like to see a compromise with Israel, and another coalition in Gaza led by Hamas, who do not seek compromise with Israel, but seek to establish a Palestinian state instead of the Jewish sovereign state. According to Hamas, and it's very clear if you look at their charter, there is no room for a Jewish sovereign entity in the Middle East, which should be an Islamic wealth. Hence, every step that Turkey is doing in support of the Hamas, whether in Gaza or, again, I cannot speak about it in more liberty, but supporting Hamas elements in Istanbul, I think Kardaş spoke about it a little bit, is not helping in achieving a solution to this conflict, but only makes it more complicated. We know it, the people in Ramallah, they know it, the people in Cairo, they know it, the people in Amman, they know it, the people in the Gulf, they know it. The current approach of the Turkish government, which is basically a pro-Hamas approach, is very destructive to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'll say one more thing. For us, Hamas is as dangerous and as destructive as PKK to Turkey. I keep saying it, and many Turkish people do not like it, but that's the reality. We keep distance from the PKK because we know for you it's a major challenge. Turkey do not keep distance from Hamas, and by hugging Hamas day in and day out, politically and not politically, let me not speak about it more, Turkey is becoming part of the problem instead of becoming part of the solution.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gilad. Actually, this is not in order, but there's a follow-up question from Aykan Erdemir. It's for you again, Mr. Gilad, so I'm just reading it. Does the rising anti-Semitic sentiment in Turkey pose an obstacle to improving Turkish-Israeli relations? Will Turkey's future political elite be able to ignore Turkish public opinion to restore bilateral ties? Do you expect Turkish public opinion to change rapidly in parallel with a potential change in the attitudes of the Turkish political elite?
Thank you. I think basically we have two questions here. The first one has to do with trends of anti-Semitism, growing trends of anti-Semitism in Turkey, mainly, by the way, following the COVID-19. That's unfortunately a phenomenon we see in many other places in Europe, also in the US. And here I can say that indeed we are witnessing this phenomena here as well as in other places. It's not unique to Turkey. Again, you can find it in many other places whenever there is kind of a challenge, then it's the fault of the Jews. I think the government is doing something to minimize this issue here. Much more can be done. I see often, I myself wrote an article lately following something that I saw really very extreme that was published in some of the media here. I believe that the government of Turkey can do and should do more in order to eradicate or eliminate this phenomena that, again, is not unique of anti-Semitism, which is not unique to Turkey, but it can be found also in Turkey. And I believe the government is doing something. We can do much more to get rid of it. There is 15,000, nearly 50,000 Jewish people living in Turkey, in Istanbul, in Izmir, and other places, and we have to make sure that those people will feel that they are living at home when they live in Turkey. As for the public opinion, we are aware that among different elites in Turkey, urban elites, economic elite, academic elite, media elite, all kind of business elite, you can find that there is a different voices vis-a-vis Israel, different than the voices we hear from the government, positive voices, voices that are looking for less confrontation and more dialogue. And yes, I expect those voices to influence basically the talk, the conversation here Turkey, which is a democracy, and I expect the people here who set the national agenda. Dr. Kardaş spoke much about AKP foreign policy. I'm not a Turkish citizen, hence I'm not going to speak about the AKP foreign policy, but I can say clearly that I hear one thing from many of the elites in Turkey: a positive dialogue vis-a-vis Israel, a wish to make a change, and unfortunately, a much more conservative voice that I hear from the government.
Thank you, Mr. Gilad. Another follow-up question on the public opinion, and Gallia, Şaban Bey, your opinions are also appreciated. And this is from Karel Valenci. Even if every problem between the two countries is solved and the two leaders start to communicate regularly, how they can overcome the negative public opinion already established? To both speakers, thank you. Gallia, please go ahead.
I think if the two leaders stop the rhetorical battles, that will be useful. And in the last few months, we didn't have these rhetorical battles, and I think that was good. But I agree that both in Israeli public opinion, the image of Turkey is not good as it, of course, not as it used to be. It's interesting also that basically Turkish-Israeli relations was not an issue of a quarrel between the right and left in Israel. When the relations were good in the 1990s, both the left and the right supported it. And today, for different reasons, both the left and the right have problems with Turkey, and specifically with Erdogan's rhetoric against Turkey. The right, of course, does not see favorably that Turkey is pushing the Palestinian agenda. The right is not looking favorably that the Turkey is pushing the Palestinian agenda, and the left is seeing Turkey as an example for domestic developments in Israel that are dangerous. So many times in the election campaign, people said compared between Netanyahu and Erdogan, and when there are problems in the academic, in the legal system, then people say we don't want to become. We don't want to be, the Turkish example is a negative one we don't want to follow. Just a positive note from this past week, in Israel, as I said, we have a problem of the coronavirus getting out of control. So we were thinking, the policymakers are thinking of imposing a curfew in weekends. So there was a comparison, for example, with the curfew weekends in Turkey. And I thought that was nice. I mean, it was just, both states comparing their situation to deal with day-to-day events. That was nice. But in general, there is a problem of hostility to Turkey in the Israeli public opinion as well.
Thank you, Gallia. Şaban Bey, would you like to add?
Yeah, very briefly, as I said, overall, actually, the Turkish public Israel indifference is there. As I highlighted in my intervention, if at the leadership level there is some understanding, the opposition will not be big. It will be, of course, from a specific core of Akbar's constituency, more conservative segments of the society. As a matter of fact, during the normalization deal, as Gallia also referred to it earlier, we have tested it. There was a reaction because of the public perception of Magi, Marmara incident, the compensation package, the court cases, so on and so forth. There was a reaction from a certain constituency of Akbar, but President Erdogan was very skillfully able to overcome it. And he did challenge actually the İHA supporters, İHA base, regarding even the very Marmara incident. So my argument would also second to Gallius that if there is an understanding at the leadership level, they can, in the Turkish context, easily overcome whatever objections that may come from their base, and they can contextualize such a decision.
Thank you, Şaban Bey. I will combine the two questions from Barçın Yinanç and Ferhat Pirinççi on the Turkey, Libya, Egypt triangle. And basically it's open for the panel, and it follows as, what's the likelihood of Turkish-Egyptian hot confrontation in Libya? What could be the repercussions of such confrontation on Turkish-Israeli relations? Maybe Şaban Bey, you can go first, and then we continue with Gallia, and if Mr. Gilad wants to add as well.
Yeah, the Libya crisis recently has taken or can take a new form, can be escalated further into direct interstate involvement. So far it was more in the form of proxy dynamics, but increasingly there is this risk of escalation into kind of direct interstate confrontation. And Egyptian determination, at least expression of willingness to militarily respond, has escalated the stakes. But despite that, I think the breaks, strategic breaks are there. Behind the scenes, I see a lot of initiatives to prevent such a scenario from happening, mediation by different international actors to find a solution at this stage. So probably we will see the outcome in the coming days, weeks. Personally, I don't expect the escalation of the current crisis into a direct Egyptian Turkish conflict of sorts, because I underline sorts because it can take different forms, but at this point, direct confrontation probably will not take place.
Thank you. Gallia?
I mean, when Israel looks at Libya, its direct interest is that no terror will come from Libya to Israel, and no weapons will come from Libya to Gaza, which did happen after Gaddafi's fall in 2011. And also, of course, the Turkish agreement with the Government of National Accord in Libya about the delimitation of the maritime borders does complicate matters for Israel, Cyprus, and Greece when they want to build the East Mediterranean pipeline. But as we already mentioned, because of energy prices, and this project is problematic. It was problematic from begin words because it's very ambitious, it's very expensive, and now with the decline in energy prices, it's probably even more complicated. That I always say are the direct Israel's interests with regard to Libya. But of course, because it's become a regional confrontation about regional dominance, there is a problem that some of the countries Israel are cooperating with are basically supporting the side that Turkey opposed to. But it's not a simple issue because, for example, the US position is not clear, but currently it seems that it's more supporting the Turkish side, and the Russian position is more on the opposite side, and it's not clear that Israel necessarily wants to support Russia on this issue. So it's a complicated matter. It does require Israel's attention. On the face of it, Israel would not want to be withdrawn to this conflict, but regional dynamics are very complicated. So.
Just very briefly, following what Gallia said, I want to speak less about the Libyan issue, but more to reflect on what was said earlier on, that if Israel is a partner of the Anti-Turkish Alliance in the East Med, it's true that Israel has a strategic alliance with Cyprus, with Greece, with Egypt, close relationship with UAE. It's true that some of those members of the alliance have some major difficulties with Turkey. It is not true, however, that Israel is conducting an anti-Turkish policy. The fact that we have partnership with Greece, Cyprus, Egypt on energy doesn't make us an anti-Turkish element in the East Med. And I just draw your attention to the fact that not everything that is being said from Athens, from Nicosia, from Cairo, vis-a-vis Turkey is being reflected automatically also from Jerusalem. So indeed, are we partners of this? Are we strategic partners of those elements? Turkey, Egypt, Cyprus, Greece, UAE? The answer is yes. Does it make us automatically an anti-Turkish element in the East Med? No.
Thank you, Mr. Gilad. Just on these notes, there is a question from Ellen Makovsky for Şaban Bey, and it follows as, to your knowledge, do Turkish policymakers see Israel as playing a covert role backing Haftar, as some in the Turkish media have claimed?
Well, I don't have any direct information about such a Turkish assessment of Israel's involvement. It is just a speculation, especially in terms of logistics, intelligence, facilitating the UAE involvement in the Libyan crisis. So such an argument is being speculated around, but personally I am not in a position to corroborate that.
Thank you. And there is one question on Syria. It's from Kadri Taştan, and it's open for the panel. We know more or less which kind of Syria Turkey wants to see in 5 or 10 years, meaning a Syria without any Kurdish political entity. What about Israel? What should be Syria that Israel wants to see in the future? Gallia, would you like to go first?
I think Syria has surprisingly not been an area of conflict between Turkey and Israel. Basically, Turkey is more interested in what is happening in northern Syria, and Israel is more interested in what is happening in southern Syria. So in this respect, there has not been any conflict of interest. And with regard to what Israel would like to see, of course, a Syria that does not have Iranian involvement in it, does not have Hezbollah on its territory. It doesn't want a border with Hezbollah also in Syria. It's enough that it has Hezbollah on the border with Lebanon. That's the main issue. With regard to Assad himself, of course, Israel would also like to see his fall, but it did not actively try to topple him.
Thank you. Şaban Bey, Mr. Gilad, please.
May I just say briefly that not that there isn't any conflict of interest between Israel and Turkey on Syria. I think there is even a common interest. I think it is the same instability which can be found in Syria since 2011, which is bothering and challenging both Turkey in North Syria and Israel in South Syria. Eventually, it is the same proxies, mainly Iranian proxies, that are challenging Turkish soldiers in North Syria and Israeli soldiers in South Syria. Indeed, I think Gallia said later on that Turkey is mainly concerned from Kurdish elements in North Syria. We have no problem with the Kurds, definitely not to be found in the South Syria. But yet, I think at the end of the day, the negative influence of elements like Iran on the Turkish soil is a problem not only for Israel, but also for Turkey. There are all kinds of reports in the international media of Iranian targets, Iranian boats that are being targeted day in and day out in Syria. I don't know who's behind those attacks, but I have a feeling that those attacks, how should I put it diplomatically, do not cause any concern in Ankara, maybe even some satisfaction that you'll have to ask Turkish officials. I'm not sure how open they will speak about it, but basically both Turkey and Israel are facing the same challenges in Syria, not completely equivalent. Indeed, Turkey has a problem with the Kurds, which we do not have, but many other elements that contribute to the lack of stability in Iran are the same rivals of both Israel and Turkey.
Thank you. We have 6 minutes to go and 2 remaining questions. And the first one is from Barçın Yinanç. Anyone knows what Palestinians are telling behind the scenes to Ankara in terms of Turkey's strained relationship with Israel? Who wants to pick this? Maybe Mr. Gilad, would you like?
Yeah, we don't know what's going on behind the doors, but as Roey mentioned, there is no single Palestinian voice. We know the differences, they are obvious. Probably different parties are telling different things based on their different readings of how the future of Palestinians in the region how the relationship with Israel will be shaped. So they are telling different things.
Let me just say and echo what my friend Dr. Kardaş said. I'll put it short and briefly and diplomatically. I think that Jerusalem is not the only party which is concerned and unhappy about the relationship between Ankara and the Hamas. And let me say no more. I think Ramallah is not in love with those relationships just as we do, though from obvious reasons, Ramallah cannot be as vocal as we do.
Thank you. And the last question is from Ferhat Prinççu to Mr. Gilad. Does he see a common ground or shared concern with Turkey regarding the rising xenophobia and anti-Semitism, Islamophobia in Europe?
Yeah, I think there is a common denominator between anti-Semitism and xenophobia. Eventually, the same trend that offend the Jewish minority can also offend Muslim minority. In the past, there were attempts by Jewish communities and Muslim communities in Europe to cooperate in facing this challenge. Again, I would use this podium that the GMF gives me to call again on the Turkish government to do more on this issue of fighting anti-Semitism in Turkey. The government is doing some steps, but it's not enough. And I think the voice we need to hear from Ankara challenging anti-Semitic trends here in Turkey should be much louder.
Thank you very much for the responses. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. And we're about three minutes before we end. I want to thank you for answering all of these questions. I'm struck by some of the things that have been missing a bit from the conversation, which is typical for challenges in this region, which is one is the United States. I don't think any of our speakers have really talked about the role of the US or Europe in this space. No one has mentioned Moscow as well, and the role that Russia has been playing in the Eastern Med and in Libya, including in Libya as well. And it just struck me that this conversation has become so regional in context, in terms of relationships, in terms of response to crisis, that I think it's been really important to hear from all of you today about these perspectives. And Gallia, I also want to thank you for bringing up the issues of democracy, both in Israel and then also talking about Turkey as well. How the current political systems in each country, which are robust in many ways, but also have shifted in terms of nationalism, populism, real issues that are impacting how people internally are viewing themselves, politics, and foreign policy. And I think if I could just speculate that what we're seeing globally with COVID-19 is become some pretty dramatic shifts in how populations view governments, which I think will have long-term ramifications, even for political parties and issues of concern. You touched on some of them. We didn't get deeply into some of these more challenging culture issues, but anti-Semitism is obviously an important challenge to tackle in Turkey, but also how people view the laws in Israel with respect to Arab populations and concerns about those issues also plays out not only in Turkey, but globally as well. It impacts the perspective of Israel in this issue. So one, I just want to thank everybody. And before we sign off, I wanted to give each one of you just a final minute thought. Again, I still come back to the point that I wish we could say that the relationship was a glass half full, but that's not the case right now. But hopefully based on these types of conversations and others, there'll be a roadmap forward, if not today, but in the near future. Roey, if I could just turn to you first for any final thoughts that you have. And thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us here today.
I think I rest most of my case, maybe even more than what I plan to rest. You know, I think I said enough. Let me really thank German Marshall Fund, you personally, and the two speakers who spoke today on top of myself. And I think the most important thing that we can expect from such a webinar is to, I would say, support the public debate which we have here in Turkey concerning the future relationship with Israel, because as I said earlier on, I think there is a significant public debate here about this issue. I think the Turkish government is having a very conservative policy vis-a-vis Israel, but I think we hear many, many voices in many, many parts of Turkey that would like to see this change, and I expect those voices to be echoed among the government elements here in Ankara. Thank you.
Thank you. Şaban? Turn on the mute.
Yeah. I am back. Yeah, actually, Alan Makowski had a second question, which is relevant to my concluding remarks, I would say. Do you have any concern that the current poor state of bilateral relations will devolve into hostilities? I would say no. To reiterate what I already said during my intervention, let's remember this last decade of poor relations took place against the background of a very fragile Middle Eastern security environment. So from a glass half full, half empty perspective, when we look at the full side, the relationship endured, managed to avoid going even deeper, turning into direct hostilities. And in that respect, I think, speaking of the future, no, it won't go into direct hostilities, considering how it also managed to handle some of the delicate differences. In the days to come, I think some form of compartmentalization, though difficult, will make the relationship a sustainable enterprise in the region.
Great. Thank you, Şaban. Gallia?
I'd just like to repeat that I think the return of ambassadors is a realistic aim. It won't solve everything, but I think it would be a positive move forward. And I agree with you that the role of the United States is, we didn't mention it, but it is important. During the Obama years, the administration did push the two countries to solve the differences between them. During the Trump years, basically the United States stayed out, and when it did things like, for example, the move of the US Embassy to Jerusalem, this actually caused a further rupture in Turkish-Israeli relations. So I think whichever administrations comes into office in November, they should keep an eye on Turkish-Israeli relations. You don't want these things to get out of the control, and the US can play a positive role here. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I just want to, again, thank all of our speakers on behalf of the German Marshall Fund. We want to thank you. We look forward to our next conversation. And also a quick thank you to Jalan and Zach Tarrant here in the United States too for helping pull this together. Hope everybody has a good rest of their day. Stay safe and healthy. And we look forward to our next conversation. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.